Hello, and welcome to the preview of episode 68, Symbiosis of Drawing and Models, the Process. So, series of ruminations that we do once a week, early Sunday mornings, so we can kind of stay up late on Saturday and kind of like have fun. Anyway, so congratulations are due to Julie. Through her diligence and hard work, right? We now have 200 subscribers, and we're almost at 100 videos. Yeah. So I kind of find it as if
yay.
Julie has found a way to find to convince people that aside from the things that she says, which are brilliant, even the things that I'm saying may be worth enough listening to that somebody would subscribe. Anyway,
I have methods.
You do, right? And no one's been hospitalized. There's been no charges made.
I talk you up. I promise them if they subscribe, they'll get superpowers. It works like a charm.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, what this is we do a series of talks about issues that are important to us in our development as artists, architects, researchers, writers. And, one of us will pick a project and, pick a term, and then we kind of do a criticism, an observation from the other side. So this is this is something that's close to me in terms of my working method. Mm-hmm. So basically what I would say is it's a potential for divination of consequential perspectives. Okay. And I'll go into what all these things mean. If not tonight, then on Sunday, leading to the identification of novel utility through the emancipation of this two specific processes towards their mutualism. Okay, now we've talked about all these terms before, and if you've been following along, this might make sense, but let me just kind of break it down quickly. When I was in architectural school and I started to kind of understand how much fun it was, and I kind of really loved architectural school. I've loved architecture since I was a boy. I just didn't realize I was an architect until I was till I kind of learned the definition and had to define what the definition was for me. But as a result, I loved drawing. I loved model building. They were both more fun than the projects themselves. So what I realized was over time, I started to understand this thing, which also I now see as having social implications. But I started to see the fact that the drawings and the model building should, rather than being dependent on some other story of organizational kind of inertia, they should be free to kind of exist within their own symbiosis. Now, what I mean is the drawings and the models basically became the process themselves rather than being kind of accessories to the crime. And I think that was because I found as if the very static utility with which architecture had kind of straitjacketed itself had given itself no way out. So as a result, I find as if certain things that I saw in other work kind of alluded to this, possibility. And then I kind of thought to myself, maybe the process itself needs to be what kind of helps us. And I think, again, when the drawing and the model are kind of straitjacketed and the organizational structure is kind of determined outside of that or not by that process, it doesn't really question the utilities of the organizational matrix. So with that said, that's a kind of the process by which I've started to kind of work amongst myself. We talked a little bit about models last week, but now we're going to talk about the symbiosis, the mutualism. So let me give us a little bit of an idea of what symbiosis is. Symbiosis is a scientific term relating to the relationship amongst things. And there's a series of different things. There's mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, let's say amenalism, and competition. Now, there's also different kind of things in terms of that, in terms of the fact that there's kind of an obligate versus a facultative. An obligate means that one or both of the symbionts either depend on each other for survival, in the case of a facultative where one is independent. So again, all these things are kind of nuances of it, but the idea is I'm using this analogy of this organic circumstance, kind of talk to how I believe the speculative nature, which we also kind of use the analogy of induction from Whitehead and from Hume, could conceivably lead to this process. So with that said, which is certainly a mouthful, as Julie said, but I kind of think that this makes sense to me, and I think it's had some value. So That's my brief definition of something. I'll go much more into detail on Sunday. So, P.
Okay. I'd like to discuss Mingei. Mingei, everyday Japanese objects.
Oh, okay.
They tend to be lumped in as folk craft, and I think it diminishes their stature, it diminishes their artistry, it diminishes their importance. In fact, they are models for going about your daily life. And they are drawn in this fashion. They are often incorporated into album leaves, into calligraphic texts, into wall scrolls, into painting, into silk scrolls, which would then elevate this model or object and basically, enshrine it and ennoble it. And I don't think people who created the Mingei think about that. I will mention a phenomenal exhibition that just opened at Japan Society, where they're very nice. And I promised to mention, especially because it correlates beautifully and perfectly with our prescribed show. There's an exhibition called House to House on the work of a lone artist, a craftsman who made Mingei. I mean, these are everything from tea bowls to serving trays to strange masks to a series of pipes in brass that could be compared to the most sophisticated things that Brancusi ever sculpted. Most of his things are very rough hewn, and Mingei are rough and rugged. They're not usually very sophisticated, but who's to say? I mean, he has some very sophisticated ideas of planar structure, of what a volume holds, of shapes from ink droppers, water droppers, to ink stones, to many sort of traditional, highly esteemed Japanese objects that this man refashioned before and during and after World War II, which took an enormous toll. And I believe that the circumstances of the world have a huge impact on models' drawings and their use and their makers. So that is another aspect.
So this is an introduction of an object into an environment in an attempt to complicate the circumstance?
Not complicate, to be used on a daily basis. It's your partner in life. It is something that's very quotidian, very utilitarian, but there's an awful lot of ingenuity and invention. And these are models.
Is there a novelty to them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so there's a novelty to what? Novel. Okay, so what happens is, as a result of introducing their novelty to the environment then therefore kind of gets destabilized.
Yes, or reshaped,
transfigured.
Okay. They evolve their environment that they are placed into. They are used. These are objects for use, but many of them
Mingei.
Mingei, yes. Mingei.
Okay, so it's a kind of object
for daily use. They are considered folk crafts, but there are some incredibly articulate, very interesting and inventive Mingei.
Utility. Whose novel utility? Utility.
Yeah, I would say they are evolving models for a daily life. They are, in fact, models of industrial design.
Configuration.
Yeah. So, do you need a moment? Okay. I'll continue.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So think about these very early models, and these are ID products. These
question.
Sure.
The Mingei is an object inserted whose novel utility introduces transfiguration of environment.
Yes, inserted into one's daily life.
Very, okay,
very
that's
important.
good. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And I would stress that these are part of your life. They're almost a pet. They're almost a friend. Mm-hmm. They become cherished objects. They are passed down.
Because remember, we talked last week about the temporary state, right? In terms of like the idea of induction. And the fact that like the inductive process was a temporary state. It's something that kind of is kind of
I've got photos. I'll save them for Saturday.
Interesting. It's good. I
have about 75 photos actually.
Okay.
There's also a documentary film in the Japan Society exhibition. Didn't get a chance to see it. Okay. Had a couple meetings. Didn't have time.
Good.
But
because I think in my case, because I think in my case, I'm thinking about a process to kind of just focus on the perspective, so that can basically allude to novel utility. But this seems to be the introduction into an existing environment. I mean, I've never really thought about, I always liked the idea of, starting completely from the process itself, and it's kind of like an independent thing. This is basically a situation that creates a much more complex symbiotic circumstance. Mine is a situation of mutualism of the processes, whereas what you're alluding to is the idea of the possibility of a parasitism or commensalism or amenalism in terms of so it's really not a mutualism. It's actually quite different, because it's actually an activity that exists within. It's the introduction of an agent into a stable environment, or a potentially destabilizing factor.
Well, here's a quick example and a little tantalizing hint of what is to come.
Like this.
Think of it's really fascinating. Think of the sublime, elegant, hushed nature of your classic Japanese tea ceremony. No milk and sugar, guys. And in this exhibition, as you will see, there are a number of extremely archaic, very odd-looking tea bowls. Now, a traditional tea bowl has subtleties of texture, of color. They did not have things affixed to the outside, like ever. I mean, that would have been considered very blasphemous. These are full of things that were affixed, and in fact, a lot of them were cast in molds, in plaster molds, which is a very rare. So it changed the way some people started working in ceramics. So it does have the property, and it changed what kind of tea was served. You didn't serve matcha in these. They were too weird and crude for that. You served a very rough and ready kind of like an everyday, tea, a fermented tea. Not the fresh, bright, grassy matcha.
Interesting. Okay.
So it changed everything.
All right. So last words, last thoughts.
When an activity is not only altered by a model, but is birthing new ways to do that activity and proposes new ways of forging activities, you end up with a paradigm shifting model. You end up with a whole new relationship.
I mean, that's interesting, because I never really think of the alteration of existing circumstances. I always find them as kind of somewhat insipid and worthless. So, but I mean, in this case, if the transfigurations and the alterations create consequence in terms of novel utility, novel utility is the goal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I like that. All right. So this is interesting. I think we found a good workable format. Is that one of us comes up with a theme that is very personal to that person, and the other individual has a kind of critique or an observation, so that we kind of have a back and forth. All right. So that's great. So Sunday morning, 2:00, and in this case, it won't be a 2-hour program, because we had we had our program go on at the change of the time. So
it wasn't
when we finished, it was at 4:00, even though it'd been an hour. Right. So anyway, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's the benefit of all for us to keep it just that way.
Minge.